The biblical scholar Dr. James Tabor, a non-Christian, offered some criticisms about the way in which Paul used Old Testament scripture. So I produced a response to those criticisms and posted it on our iPUB YouTube channel for the non-believing world. But I thought it would be good for Christians also to listen to Dr. James Tabor give the way in which he understands these Old Testament texts versus the way Paul uses them. And maybe for a small group or for you as an individual to think about this. How would you respond yourself to Dr. James Tabor? So after you listen to his interview where he makes a few minutes of remarks, you should pause the video and work together or work as an individual through the passage and try to understand how you would respond to the details of his criticisms. And then you can unpause the video and you can watch my response, and then you can pause it again after my response and you can offer your criticisms of my response and how you might be able to improve on that. So I thought that this would be a good exercise for Christians as well. So I hope you enjoy this and I hope it's helpful.
Genesis 15, verse 6, that Abraham, before he was circumcised, that's in chapter 17. So I think the day he found this, he was jumping around the room. Wow. So my people aren't circumcised, but if they believe God, they can be justified by faith. Because it says here, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about. Well, of course he wasn't justified by works. No human being is without sin. That's Hebrew Bible all the way through. For what does Scripture say? Now look at the quote. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Well, that sounds kind of good. Abraham's a sinner. But in Genesis 15, is Abraham a sinner? What did he believe God? He put his trust in God. God had just told him, you're going to have a son, you see? And that it's not going to be Ishmael. This is a son of promise. And he believed God. And I would translate it and understand it, and I'm not, dogmatic on this. Abraham believed God and counted him as righteous. God. Not Abraham became righteous by believing, but God said, I'm going to give you a son. He didn't stagger in unbelief, as Paul says, but he was firm in his trust. So he believed God and reckoned or counted God as righteous, meaning God's going to do what he said. So it's almost the same point as Habakkuk on the end. Both verses that are his favorite verses have to do with a righteous, not how to get righteous, but a righteous person having faith, even if it looks like you're not going to have a kid because you're 99 years old and Sarah's past, what is she, 75 or something, not menstruating. So, and he goes, no, I'm going to believe God and I'm going to count him as righteous. And if he said it, he's going to do it. I think that's a better understanding of that verse. If you look, the Hebrew is pretty clear, really.
Tabor's main contention with Paul's use of Genesis 15:6 is that Paul misreads who the subject and object are in the second clause. The customary translation is Abram believed the Lord, and he, God, counted it, his faith, to him, Abram, as righteousness. But Tabor says the translation should read Abram believed the Lord, and he, Abram, counted it, the promise, to him, God, as righteousness. That is, the he and the him are swapped by Tabor, and the it is read as the promise and not as Abram's faith. Tabor is obviously correct that the Hebrew grammar could be read this way, because the subject and object aren't expressly stated. Also, his reason for reading it as Abram counting God's promise to God as righteousness seems to have a simple attractiveness. Why change the subject in the middle of the verse if the text doesn't explicitly do so? Abram is simply believing and praising God in response to God's promise. The problem with this reading is that every early Jewish writer who refers to the verse reads the grammar the same way Paul does, or at least all of the many references to the verse I know of read it in the traditional way and not as Tabor. In fact, the Standard English translation of the Tanakh, produced by the Jewish Publication Society, still reads the grammar the same way Paul does, and he put his trust in Adonai, who reckoned it to his, Abram's, merit. For my part, I couldn't find a single other example where God is the object of this verb, to count or reckon. And despite the seeming simplicity of Tabor's reading, the internal logic of the sentence seems to demand that God is the subject, not the object. In other words, the most natural way to read it is as Paul does. For the word counted, chashav, means to impute a value of one thing to another thing, where the second thing is not normally understood to have the same value. That's how it's used throughout the rest of Genesis. A clear illustration of its meaning is found in Numbers 18, verses 26 to 27. Moreover, you shall speak and say to the Levites, when you take from the people of Israel the tithe that I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present a contribution from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. And your contribution shall be counted, chashav, to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor. In other words, when a Levite received, say, 30 pomegranates as a tithe from the people, they would take 3 of these pomegranates and offer them as their own tithe. God counted their 3 pomegranates as if they were taken from a Levite orchard, which of course no Levite actually possessed. God counted the one thing as if it had the value of a second thing, though it clearly did not. In Genesis 15:6, the main point is obviously that Abram's trust is not the equivalent of a right standing with God, wherein Abram fulfilled all his obligations to God and obeyed him according to the full terms of their covenant. Abram's works in themselves could not have put him in a right standing with God, since he famously fell short of his basic obligations. So God counts Abram's trust in him as if it is righteousness. Abram's faith is valued to him as righteousness, even though Abram in his works falls short of being righteous. Let's review the progression of thought in the passage. Abram expresses doubt that God can fulfill his promises to his offspring, since he and Sarah are getting older and have no children. Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household, his servant Eliezer, will be my heir. In response, God challenges Abram, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. So shall your offspring be. Whatever number Abram might give for the total number of stars will be incalculably fewer than the actual number of stars. That is, God's promise wildly exceeds Abram's ability to value it. And then it adds, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. If Abram is counting God's promise to God as righteousness, he's valuing the promise exactly for what it is. But that's the opposite of the word's connotation. Now note the word play. Just as Abram couldn't number the stars and thus would undervalue the scope of God's promise, so God now overvalues Abram's personal righteousness by counting his trust as if it alone fulfills Abram's obligations in the covenant. In other words, the value of God's grace to Abram in future promises, as well as in his present standing, was orders of magnitude above what Abram deserved or what he was expecting. But again, you don't have to rely on this analysis of Genesis 15, just rely on the unanimous judgment of Jewish translators and commenters, both ancient and modern, who have understood the grammar exactly as Paul does. But let me know what you think about these things in the comments, and I'll try to respond to substantive criticisms.